Hey, Siri, before we get rolling here, I just wanted to say, in doing research for this episode, I just have to say that the Vikings were such an interesting and weird group of people. And in some ways, they were so far ahead of their times. Do you know how one group of Vikings would communicate with another group of Vikings?
I have many ideas, but I don't think that my ideas are what you're getting at, Doug.
Norse code.
Yep, there it is.
Norse code. Norse, because the Norse code. Hey, everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. Let's go back to a fairly familiar scenario that I've gone through at the beginning of quite a number of shows on What Magic Is This. You go to your local New Age crystal occult store. You walk in, you walk right past those crystals, you walk right past those sage bundles, and you go straight to the bookshelf and you take a look at the books there. And you might notice that there's quite a few books about runes. In fact, there's more books about runes than there's books about Aleister Crowley or ceremonial magic or Solomonic magic. And sometimes, usually there'll be more books about that than there will be about Wicca. And you say, wow, these runes are really something big to do with magic. It's weird that Doug has not talked about runes yet. Well, let us solve this for you right now. And we have a fantastic person to talk about the whole rune thing. My guest is a Nordic witch, professional rune and tarot reader, podcaster, and author. Recently, they have just released the book, Queering the Runes, Reclaiming Ancestral Wisdom in Rune Magic and Mythology. They are also the host of the Heathen's Journey podcast, which explores Norse paganism, traditional witchcraft, folk magic, and so much more. I would love to welcome to What Magic Is This, Siri Vincent Plouff. Siri, how are you?
I am so good. Thank you so much for having me today.
No problem. And I'm so excited to talk about this because this is seriously one of my most requested episodes ever. People are like, when are you going to talk about runes? When are you going to talk about runes? And I reached out to you and was like, let's talk about runes. And you said, yes, but not now because I'm writing a book. And I said, okay, when is that going to be done? And you're like, a year. And I went, okay. And so we waited for the perfect time, and you've written this book, Queering the Runes. You've released it, and so far you say the reception has been very good. I have you here because people have so many questions about these really, really strange, weird, wonderful things that, there's hundreds of books about runes, hundreds, and there's like runes in Kabbalah, there's runes, and like it's wacky that there's so much rune stuff. So let's jump right in. What's the one thing which folks should keep in mind as we drill down into the world of runes?
Yes. So one thing to really keep in mind as we dive into this is that runes operate on, and I describe this in the book, runes operate on 3 different levels.
Okay.
We have the level of language. They are an alphabet. You can write in them. You can send little coded messages to your friends in runes, if you all know what they are. But they also operate as the sign. So they like a sign as in like, this is a symbol that can mean something for divination or magic. And they also operate on the level of the signified. So not only are they a sign, but they are used to represent an idea or concept. Which, some may say that's what a sign is, but like they go kind of deeper than that because they aren't pictorial. So you have to sort of learn these meanings based on what is essentially letters and memorize these meanings. Runes are also very, again, that 3, right? I'm going to talk about 3 different layers of working with runes. You can use them for writing, you can use them for divination, and you can use them in magic. And so they operate on a lot of really different and intersecting and wild planes. And I think that it is a mistake to discount any of those planes when you were learning them.
Although there's probably very few people listening to this show who have never come across runes at any point in their life. How would you personally describe what runes are in case somebody hasn't? You described like their capacities, but what are these physical runes?
Yeah, so these runes are essentially letters from Germanic, Scandinavian languages. They are organized into, well, the most popular ones are organized into futharks, or in the case of the Anglo-Saxon runes, the futhorc. Um, and futhark actually just stands for the phonemes, like what the letters are of those. The first, I think it's, how many letters is futhark? Seven. Or six letters or something. Yeah, because the thorn is one, the th is one letter. Yeah, so they were used for writing. And I know that we're going to dive into different runic alphabets and all of those things. There is a distinctly cultural Germanic Scandinavian. These are specifically Germanic Scandinavian languages that these were used for. So you wouldn't necessarily say that like the Thracian alphabet is oh my god, I just had this like horror flash before my eyes that I mispronounced that. It's Thracian, right?
Thracian, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So, you wouldn't necessarily call Thracian symbols runes, right? It is very Proto-Germanic. And so, yeah, that's essentially what they are. They're letters that we have assigned meaning to, and meaning beyond the phonemes, beyond the sounds that they represent.
What time period are we talking about specifically as far as like what might be like the earliest runes? How far back do they go?
Yes. So this is actually really exciting because as I was preparing for this episode, I found out that in 2021, they found what is possibly the oldest rune stone. And that was discovered in Ringerike, Norway. And
Norse.
that is right, yeah. And that was roughly 2,000 years ago that they're dating that stone to. So we're talking, you know, early hundreds. Let's just put it that way, early hundreds. So they're a pretty old alphabet. They're not as ancient as, say, the Roman alphabet or the Greek alphabet. And in many ways, people will say that, they were very likely developed by Germanic tribes after they had connection with the Romans or connection with Italians. So there are a lot of different theories as to where exactly they came from, like what language did they develop from. And so, as far as I can kind of narrow it down, there are several primary theories. Of course, the Italic and Mediterranean influence, especially Roman influence. However, there's also a theory that gets more specific that it was developed by Gothic tribes, Gothic Germanic tribes, based upon the Etruscan alphabet, which has, as far as I understand, some slight differences. Some also say that it was developed out of the Phoenician alphabet, that was probably of greater influence. And then still others say that the old Latin alphabets and the Radic and Venetic alphabets were of the most great influence. So we don't actually know fully where they come from because it's literally ancient history at this point, right?
What do you think as somebody who interacts with runes? Where do you think they mostly come from? Do you have a dog in the fight, if you will, or is it just kind of like they just exist?
I kind of don't really have a dog in the fight,
No, no.
honestly. I mean, I've thought about going to school for runology. Like I could
Right,
become
right,
a
yeah.
I could become a Scandinavian studies, medieval studies, Old Norse scholar, and ultimately decided not to do that because the field of academia is a horror show for jobs right now. Um, and while I'm not ruling it out, like I could still go back to school for that, I think, and get a lot out of it. I just haven't. And even then, I would probably be more akin to a cultural scholar than I would a linguistic scholar. Although, of course, linguistics are incredibly important as the way that people are able to talk shapes our viewpoints on the world. So, of course, I would have to become fluentish in Old Norse, probably Old English as well, to study these things. I personally, and this is just completely off the cuff, I have not thought about this prior to you asking me this question. So, listeners, beware before you repeat any of this. I also would not be surprised if the runes, if the Nordic peoples had interaction with Celtic tribes as well. Um, and I know that Ogham, there would have been connection between Scandinavians and folks on the what is today known as the British Isles. So who knows, really?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Who knows? I did a lot of research for this episode, like more than I was expecting to do, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, the connections to the Phoenician alphabet are startling to me. The Phoenicians are one of my favorite subjects to look at, and it's just like that. There's these. It's not in any way, shape, or form, or in any way, scholars are like, this is not the leading theory as to where they come from, but a lot of people are like, there's some very interesting connections here. But yeah, it's something that there's tons of scholarly debate. But speaking of which, when one starts to look at runes, and particularly in this day and age, you find that a lot of scholars disagree with each other about how to contextualize the runes. There's these they're not flame battles, but there's these people making YouTube videos, and then scholars making YouTube videos, and then other people releasing retorts and arguing back and forth. And it's just like, it's not an alphabet, it's only symbols. And it's like, no, it's not only symbols, it's an alphabet. And then on the other side, you have a lot of people who are neo-pagans that say things like as far out as that, these runes are actually from Atlantis. And so that's how you can, like, just everything. So how do we avoid the pitfalls of like what the academics and scholars say, as well as what, you know, not just like the far out Atlantean neo-pagans, but even just that people who have more romanticized ideas about what these runes, how do we avoid both pitfalls?
I think the answer is, well, first of all, anytime I hear somebody say anything about Atlantis, I'm like, all right, I am filing that one away for the future.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
there are certain buzzwords that I feel like people just get really interested in. And, if that is your cup of tea, if that is your rabbit hole, you are creating that reality for yourself at this point. I think that in terms of the scholarly attitudes, um, there's a lot of pushback from scholars on, like, why would occultists even go there? This is very clearly just an alphabet. This is for writing things down, like, why would people go there? Um, and there's sort of this, like, dare I say, like, post-enlightenment modernist, like, cult of rationality and science about it, right? That, like, oh, like, magic doesn't exist, I can't quantify it. But that doesn't stop people from practicing magic. You'll never stop people from practicing magic. It's first of all, it's fascinating. Second of all, it's more fun if you believe in magic. And, there's a reason why mystery traditions and mysticism in general are a part of, most of, if not all of, the world's major religions, right? This is a thing that we are drawn to as humans. We love to make meaning about things, and part of making meaning about them is, okay, well, how can I influence this? How can I make changes? To say it in a very, like, heathen centric way, how can I make changes to the web of weird, right? What is that I'm going to do? And So that is kind of my response to scholars is that I don't care that they don't believe that runes can be used for magic. Now, I do think that heathens, as we are using runes, most of the heathens I know are a very scholarly group of people. Um, Possibly, and I don't want to start any weird flame wars here at all, like said completely lovingly, possibly more so than other branches of paganism that I found. We have a group of people who are reconstructing or creating religious belief and praxis, where you can actually, like, you could go and get a master's in runology. Like, I could and I know the programs, like I could go to the University of Iceland and become a rune studies scholar. There is archaeology about centering around this. And then there's also like a great deal of um, there's a great deal of cultural artifacts, cultural significance, and symbolism that goes into studying Old Norse and um, Nordic studies, Viking studies, generally speaking. So most people that I know are very invested in the debates, actually, that scholars have about, even just like, oh, wow, what is the Phoenician influence on the Germanic alphabets? What would that have been? I know many people in the heathen community who are very invested in those debates and are actively following academic articles as they're being published. So I think that there's this weird thing that happens with the ivory tower, where there's this assumption that people are not like using their free JSTOR account to read 100 articles a month, which you can do if you are an independent scholar. If you're somebody who is interested in studying these things, hot tip, you can get a free JSTOR account and you can read up to 100 academic articles a month, for free, completely for free, without being affiliated with an institution. So yeah. That also said, I do think that I I have a little bit of a bone to pick with academics, as you can tell, just because I don't approve of or appreciate snobbery and classism, which I feel like a lot of it kind of boils down to. I actually have had scholars in the field tell me not to go into medieval studies or Nordic studies because I have published so much work that I would be the laughing stock of whatever university that I attend. Um, which I think is so fascinating, right? No, it's like, okay, cool. Like,
Sure.
don't have money for it anyway, but thanks, buddy. Um, so yeah, I think it's uh that was a bit of a screed. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry for that one. But then you have again people who are maybe taking things to a greater extreme, and I actually do think that you do need to balance the pragmatic, these are the things that we know the runes were used for, um, linguistic applications of the different rune alphabets and all of that in order to have a good and full understanding of them as a rune worker.
You have the academics and they have all of their opinions, et cetera, et cetera. And it was only these were only used as an alphabet. And then you have people that only have as their basis of knowledge books about runes written by people that have more neo-pagan understandings of runes and aren't based entirely on the things that the scholars have said. And so
Mm.
how do we kind of like avoid that other area where it's like, I don't know if this person actually knows what they're talking about as far as like their understandings of the runes. Like it kind of just sounds like they're making stuff up, which is all well and good, but also like if something that they're saying is completely negated by something that we found through research, then what good is it?
Yeah, so one thing that I always recommend to my students is to when you're picking up a new book, Check the works cited, check the references pages at the back. If those are very sparse, then, take what you're reading with a grain of salt. Sometimes authors will come out and say, hey, this is my personal gnosis, enter at your own risk, which I actually really respect people who do that, right? It's like, oh, I'm putting this out there. This is my own personal gnosis. Do with that as you will, right? And just being upfront and honest about that, I think, is important. Another thing, so what I ground my understanding of the runes in, and my how I assign meaning to them, is through these things called the rune poems. And these are essentially poems that were written in many different. There are several of them. There are three primary rune poems: the Icelandic, the Norwegian, and the Anglo-Saxon rune poems. And they are essentially like an A is for apple, B is for ball, but each one is like, between 2 and 4 lines that is like, oh, there's like a little mystery here, kind of like a Japanese koan or something. Not like a koan in that it's completely unknowable, but just like there is some kind of little symbolism thing happening here that is clearly more well thought out and connected with other values and morals within Nordic culture. And so I would actually recommend going back, reading those, and then as you're reading newer works about runes by neo-pagan authors, be like, oh, does this make sense with the rune poems? And if it is completely left field, then probably not. But the other thing to bear in mind too is that most neo-pagan authors writing about runes are pulling their meanings primarily from the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, but they're applying them to the Elder Futhark, not the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. And so if you are looking for, this one is just one that I know off the top of my head. The Wunyo, which is the rune for joy, does not appear in the younger Futhark. So if you're trying to find meanings for Wunyo, then you're going to look to the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, and that rune poem. I just like to have kind of all three open and like within arm's reach as I'm reading. There are also other, later rune poems. I believe there's a Swedish rune poem. There's, other knowledge that's baked in other places. But those three are kind of going to get you to the core of the meanings that were established for the runes to modern rune workers.
Got it. So let's talk about those terms that you just brought up. Futhark. What does that mean? And there's these things, elder Futhark and younger Futhark. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so Futhark is basically, it's how you would say the first 6 letters of the alphabet. Kind of like alpha beta are the first 2 letters of the Roman alphabet. So it's just set as Futhark as like, this is what this is. The Elder Futhark is the oldest complete rune alphabet that we have. There are other runes that are older, but the decoded runes that we can actually use as for translation of carvings and all of that is the Elder Futhark. And that stems from probably before 100 Common Era, but that is around when the findings start to show up. So I believe that one of the older, until the Tyrfjorden runestone was discovered literally 3 years ago, the oldest, some of the oldest that we had were the Vimos comb. And that dates to, I believe, around that era. And that is also described in, not the Elder Futhark especially, but, it is described in Tacitus's Germania. Tacitus being a Roman quote unquote historian. I say quote unquote because the Roman relationship to history at that time was not what we would describe as history now. Um, but he did actually spend time among Germanic tribes. We know this. And he did write Germania as largely a satire. But there are still some practices that are described, including a description of what could have been a rune reading. Then, as we're kind of like, as language develops, as the language is wont to do, they actually condensed, the Scandinavians actually condensed the elder Futhark into the younger Futhark. And the younger Futhark is what would have been in operation during the Viking Age, primarily. And I believe, oh my God, I am not so certain on dates, but it took longer for runes to fall out of vogue as an alphabet in Scandinavia than in Germany because Germany Christianized so much earlier. So then the younger Futhark kind of comes in around, I believe, like 900 Common Era, possibly earlier. I don't have the dates in front of me right now. Please don't burn me at the stake, all rune scholars out there. And then we also kind of simultaneously that they are condensing the Futhark in Scandinavia. The Anglo-Saxons in Scotland and Ireland, and well, not as much Ireland, although Ireland definitely had a lot of connection with the Norse peoples. Um, the Anglo-Saxons throughout what is considered the British Isles today expanded the alphabet. So the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc, and it's called a Futhorc in Anglo-Saxon because that letter is not A. It's like the O phone, the O sound is the fifth sound of the Anglo-Saxon Futhorc. And so they expanded it. The Icelanders shrunk it. And the other thing that people would do is like they would have, if you're looking at the younger Futhark, one letter, like the P and B sounds were interchangeable as a written language, not necessarily as a spoken language. And they would also, there are certain points in history where they're, adding dots or flourishes or, other things to kind of signify some sort of language. There's also the practice of combining runes to make new letters for things that you don't have a standalone letter for, especially with the younger Futhark. So yeah, and then there are also other runic alphabets. There is one that the last user of the Dalekarlian runes or Dal runes, Dalrunor in Sweden, the last user of that alphabet passed away in, I believe, the 1980s. She passed away in 1980. And there's a lot of debate about that, but basically, one of the first mentions of the Dal runes comes from 1734. So we don't know whether this was nostalgic, looking back on the runes, or as may have been popular at the time, or if this was a more like continued and unbroken runic lineage. I haven't really looked into the Dal runes very much, but I was fascinated to see that the last user of the Dal runes died in 1980 because that's very recent.
That's like I remember the 80s. I don't know if you remember. I remember aspects of the 80s. Like
Yeah.
I was there.
Yeah.
I was listening to Bruce Springsteen in the 80s. I remember Rocky 4. I remember anyhow. Oh my goodness. That's crazy.
Yeah, so it's kind of wild, right?
That's fascinating. What were runes used for when we look at some of the oldest examples of them? Is it that just they were for everything, or do we have a better idea of how they were utilized?
Yeah, so they were used as kind of everything. One of the best places if you're interested in runes, one of the best places to get information is the Briggens Rune Museum in Bergen, Norway. And this is, and my dates are going to be fuzzy here. Sorry again. But in the 1950s, a huge cache of rune sticks was discovered in Bergen, Norway, and this is a medieval city. It's a city that dates. It's a port town. It dates, very far back in Norwegian history. And the water in their bay area or in their port area just so happened to be exactly the right kind of like acidic temperature, or, I don't know exactly how, wood is preserved in water, but it was exactly the right conditions to preserve all of these rune sticks. And so they have the largest collection of remaining rune sticks in the world. And so these were sticks that people would have written on. They weren't necessarily the rune inscriptions that you'll see on like a hillside in the country or on gravestones or graffiti of Sigurd was here, like in some Irish stronghold. Like these are things that people would have like written down things. So we have everything in there from grocery lists to actual spells written in runes on these sticks to I believe I don't think that I learned about it at the Brigands Rune Museum, but I don't know if it was there. But even in like the 1600s, during the 30 Years' War, some people were using runes to send coded messages between different military factions.
Wow, really? That's
Um,
crazy. That's awesome.
yeah, yeah. So it's like it's really the full gamut. And there's one rune stick that's really famous that is like the Brigand Rune Charm is it's a love spell that has the stick is like got four different sides, and it's got one stanza essentially of a spell written on each side of it. That is very cool. There's also a rune stick that is just like, tell my husband to come home from the bar.
Perennial.
Right. Yes. Evergreen. Evergreen. Yeah, so I think that really like people can kind of limit like what they perceive the runes as having been used for, and I think people also kind of limit themselves by believing that the common folk were not literate, which was not necessarily true. I mentioned the Vimos comb earlier, and that is one of the oldest known runic inscriptions. It is considered the oldest, was until recently considered the oldest known datable runic inscription. And it said Harya, which I actually am not sure what that means. Could be a name, could be a pet name, something like that. So people really used runes almost in all of the ways that we use our own letters today.
Very cool. We obviously don't have time to go through all of the runes, and we've done a lot of talking about runes from a bit of a distance. To your mind, what are some of the more interesting runes from the Elder Futhark? Give us a couple, or at least one or two that you think are like just really cool ones that you can and I know it's tough on a podcast because you don't have the representation in front of you, but you can maybe take us through one or two runes that you like really love, like this you identify with these runes and just why they're so fascinating to you.
Yeah, I think one that is really important is Gebo or Gifu, which means gift, and goes with the G sound. And I think that that is important, particularly because of the grave importance that gifting and gifting culture had to Nordic ancestors and continues to have today. There are so many stanzas of the Havamal, which is the sayings of the High One, the second poem of the Poetic Edda, um, which is basically like Odin sitting down and like giving all these kennings and wisdom all over the place. And there's this huge section of it that is just all etiquette around gifts and giving gifts and receive how to give a gift well, how to receive a gift well, how to return things if you are not of the same standing, how to like do all of this stuff. So I think that the gift rune Gifu has is of really grave importance within, runes, generally speaking. I also really love Perthro. as the rune because Perthro is one of those, it went with the P sound. And it is one of those runes that was dropped um from the Elder Futhark into the Younger Futhark. So they used the Berkana rune, which is the B sound, as both B and P in the Younger Futhark. And that one is often translated to meaning luck. Many people also think of it as being like literal birth, like childbirth, or like, if you can think of your creative work as birthing something, like I gave birth to this novel, I birthed this novel into the world, right? But luck was also a really, really important aspect of Nordic heathenry. And in fact, it was considered one of the aspects of your soul was how much luck you were bequeathed at birth. And it's not just luck, it's also, fortune and good favor, but also, kind of your personality. There's a lot of different factors to that. And even so, because it is one of those runes that, again, it was dropped, and the meanings were condensed. Sometimes when that rune will come up in a reading, it's like, well, you're not supposed to know. Why are you asking? Like, this is the great unknown. This is the mystery of birth, or this is the mystery of something that you're not supposed to know the answer to. And I'll get that message really clearly as I'm doing divination, right? And it's like, oh, well, I guess you're being wily. Here I thought I could get some answers from you, but I guess not. So I think Parthro is really, really fascinating as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's quite a few of them. I mean, not as many as people would think, but yeah, well, as you start to go through and just take a look at them, what we believe they are ascribed to is incredibly fascinating, and we'll get into it a bit later as far as talking about divination and things of this variety. But it's incredibly fascinating to me as well. One of the things that you're going to come across when you start looking into runes is something called a rune or runic calendar. What are these, and how do they work?
Yes. So runic calendars are essentially calendars where runes were used to mark the passage of specific holidays or months. The runic calendar operates on a lunar cycle, however, rather than the Gregorian solar cycle calendars. And so you will find these old calendars, and you can kind of trace a lot of Norse folklore and society through them. If you're interested in runic calendars, a really, really good resource is Rune Harnjo Rasmussen. He is a fantastic scholar out of Denmark, and he runs the Nordic Animist
He's great.
podcast.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Rune is
he's
excellent.
so good. Yeah, and he's just a really sweet guy. I've never met him, but everything I've seen of him is really sweet. So definitely look into that. He created a rune calendar, and he releases a new one every year. One interesting thing about the rune calendars is that there are some years where there are 12 months, and there are some years where there's an extra one, a 13th month. So if you're interested in that, it's kind of good to watch for if it's a 12-month or a 13-month year. So there is a month that is kind of considered like an extra month that is added during these rune calendars. And so, as with many other like pagan calendars, the different months have different names. So we have, I'm trying to think, what month are we in now? I think we're in Slaughter Month, actually.
Nice. Slaughter month. Yeah, why not? Right.
Yeah.
it's
We're
it's
either
November, Scorpio. I mean, it's over, but slaughter month. Why not? Let's do it.
Yeah, so a lot of them were named after different harvests, right? So the slaughter month is like, okay, this is the month where we are slaughtering all the animals that we, you know, can't keep over winter. And then preserving the meat and all of that, and that's what it has to do. I mean, I think that probably the most metal month is marrow sucking month, where you are Yeah, you were in the depths of winter and you were sucking the marrow out of all the bones of the creatures that you're eating. Yeah, so we're either in Slaughter Month or Yule Month. The first Yule Month. There are two Yule months in Old Nordic ways because we love to party, apparently.
I'm a huge fan. It's one of those things, and maybe this is too much personal information for some people listening. I'm not a vegetarian, everybody. I don't know. I'm from Alberta in Canada, if you know about that place. I actually, one of my favorite things in the world to eat is marrow. So I'm all about marrow sucking month. I'm going to change whatever month that is. I'm going to cross that out on my wall calendar and put that there. Definitely. That's awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, it's very metal. Very metal. So, for people who are interested in calendars, there is a really fascinating calendar stick that developed around the Christianization of Norway and Sweden specifically. I believe mostly in Norway. It's called the Primstav. Um, and it's basically this like stick because changing from a lunar calendar to the Gregorian calendar, it may not have been the Gregorian calendar at that point, but changing to, the Roman calendar. And also now instead of being, pagan and having your holidays sort of dependent upon nature and different feasts, that you were so used to, people developed this calendar to keep track of the saint days because you would be fined if you didn't go to church on the saint days, right? So it shows, so on one side you have all the summer months and on the other side you have all of the winter months. Um and depending on what community you were in, the different saint days had different symbols that also kind of encoded messages about the existing folklore of that community. So, for example, I think it's on, oh my God, I can't remember the saint's name, but there is a saint in the spring whose saint's day is also referred to as Bear Wake Day. And so there's all this like stories about bears and stuff in the local folklore that you can kind of glean from the Primstav materials, or there's cuckoo mass, which is very specific, and we learn about how, cuckoo birds were used in love magic, troll formulas and practices and stuff like that in May. And so that's another really fascinating thing. And I think that if you first of all, I think saints are fascinating. They're very grim and um gruesome. So like the horror girly in me is just like, yes, bring on the saints. Yeah. So that stuff is all really fascinating already. And then you add on top of that the like, oh, we're adjusting from a lunar calendar to a solar calendar. So we have to suddenly keep track of all of these mass days that have specific dates. And not specific moon cycles. So, yeah, that is another kind of Nordic calendar that is very interesting for people who are curious about time passages.
Coming across runic calendars for the first time for me was a very interesting thing that I didn't think I would be as fascinated by them as I was, and they are very cool. And yeah, as you mentioned, Rune Rasmussen's work as far as producing new rune calendars, although I haven't seen one, it's very fascinating. Something almost could do a whole episode on it itself. Truly.
Yeah, really. I think that there's a lot to be said for how neo-pagans kind of reclaim the passage of time and feast days and festivals and our relationship with the natural world and all of that, from trying to revive rune calendars to exploring primstavs to cobbling together the wheel of the year to a lot of other things. Yeah.
Definitely. Now, I've come across this, and it's so silly to me that I forget what scholar it was, and I'm not going to point fingers because I couldn't remember their name if I tried, but they said that in their estimation, runes weren't used for magical purposes. They're wrong. Like I think you
Yeah.
probably agree. It's just they're so wrong. Like there's just so much other weird stuff, and it's very obvious that they were used for magic. So let's dive into runes and magic, because that's
Yes.
truly why the listeners are here. What are the intersections between runes and magic?
Well, I mean, oh my goodness. There's just so much. So I'm going to stick to talking about runes because I don't know as much about staves or staves, which are the Icelandic the later Icelandic symbols. It's just like they're not completely different, but they are different areas of study. And I've been so focused on runes that I haven't been able to get into staves yet. So future episode or whatever. But runes basically, as with any kind of symbol, they have their meaning, they have their symbolic meaning. So, they have their what I mean by that is they have their verbal, their linguistic meaning, they have their symbolic meaning, and then they have their magical meaning, which is kind of like harnessing the different spirits. And um I actually made sure to bookmark the sections of the Havamal for this question specifically that deal with runes. Do you mind if I read it?
By all means, go for it. By all means.
Okay, awesome. So this is the section of the Havamal that is known by scholars as the Runatal, which is Odin essentially bragging and talking about how adept he is with runes.
So before we jump into that, I know 90% of the people listening to this know who Odin is, but for the 10% that don't, who is Odin or Woden? Who is this?
Yes, so Odin is considered the Allfather in Nordic mythology. Um, you might have met him, one-eyed, has a couple ravens, big beard, likes to wander around a lot. He is a god of a lot of things, but as somebody who works pretty closely with Odin, I like to think of Odin as a god of seeking knowledge, like ever seeking knowledge. Odin is one that you would, call upon for assistance with communication, assistance with finding stuff. Very good for working with if you're, trying to research a topic and having difficulty finding sources. So much of the poetic and prose eddas center around Odin's exploits and stories. There are also, a lot of other figures here, but Odin's sort of the all-father. And Odin is specifically in Norse mythology the god who brought runes into the world. So this actually is really like, I think it's so silly to say that runes weren't used for magic because runes are, literally talked about as this thing that the All-Father brought into the world as a sacred tool. So, like it just goes to show, just the connection makes itself almost. So, yeah, it's just very silly to think that runes wouldn't be used for magic.
I was shocked when I read. I don't think that this person. I think this scholar was a scholar of other things. Like I think that but they just had an opinion about runes, and I read it and I was like, this person has no idea what they're talking about, because you spend 20 minutes looking into the history of this stuff, and even looking at some of the translations of some of the things that we have archaeological artifacts, and you're like, that's very clearly magic. That's very clearly a charm for luck. What do you think
We
magic is, right?
Right. Okay, so we literally have rune stones. There's a type of rune stone that they were carved and placed on top of graves to stop the dead from rising.
Yeah, what's that?
Just
They're doing it for fun.
yeah, that's just a fun little fairy tale. No, like it was very much used for they were very much used for magic. Um and I think that is just such a cool. I came across that as I was researching Draugr, which are essentially Nordic zombies, with their own Nordic revenants with their own special twists and turns. Um, And these stones were used to, stop somebody from becoming a draugr, or to like keep somebody, if they were to becoming a draugr, to keep them trapped in their grave mound. There's a lot of necromancy in Nordic magic.
But yeah, very much so. I'm sorry I interrupted you. You were about to mention something about you were about to read the Havamal.
Yes, yes. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all of them because there are 18 stanzas in which
Oh,
Odin is talking about runes. So I'm not going to read the full thing, but I'll start with the myth of how Odin found the runes.
cool. By all means.
I know that I hung on a windswept tree 9 long nights, wounded with a spear dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree of which no man knows from where its roots run. With no bread did they refresh me, nor a drink from a horn. Downwards I peered, I took up the runes, screaming I took them, then I fell back from there. 9 mighty spells I learnt from the famous son of Bolthor, Bestla's father, and I got a drink of the precious mead, I soaked from Odrerir. Then I began to quicken and be wise, and to grow and to prosper. One word from another word found a word for me. One deed from another deed found a deed for me. The runes you must find and meaningful letters, very great letters, very stiff letters, which the mighty sage colored and the huge powers made, and the rune master of the gods carved out. Odin among the Aesir, and Dane among the elves, Dvalin among the dwarfs, Osvid among the giants, I myself carved some. Do you know how to carve? Do you know how to interpret? Do you know how to color? Do you know how to question? Do you know how to ask? Do you know how to sacrifice? Do you know how to dispatch? Do you know how to slaughter? Better not to pray than to sacrifice too much. One gift always calls for another. Better not dispatched than too many slaughtered. So Thund carved before the close of nation's history, where he rose up when he came back. Basically, the rest of the poem is just Odin being like, I know all these spells, and I'm going to tell you what these spells do, but I'm not going to tell you what runes I use for them, and I'm not going to tell you how to do them. But yeah, so it's pretty explicit.
Very much so. Now, the thing that most people these days will know runes for is divination. Somebody reading your runes. And if you go onto Instagram or Facebook, there's people offering rune readings and things of that variety. One thing I do want to say, and perhaps if you have evidence to the contrary, please let me know, was that there's no hard evidence that runes were used for divination in pre-Christian times. Is that true or no?
So hmm, it's both true and not true.
Okay.
It's very subtextual, is I guess what I would try to say to that. So we do have a famous passage from Tacitus's Germania where he describes what is essentially a reading of some kind. And in this passage, I have it near memorized now. He basically says the Germanics are fascinated with the casting of lots. They will take a branch from a fruit-bearing tree and cut it into discs and carve symbols on those discs. And when wisdom is needed, they will go to either the main patriarch of the family, or if it's a matter of state, like a nation state issue, then the king or the leader of the tribe will go to the priest, who will then look to the sky, throw the runes upon earth. He doesn't say runes. Throw the lots upon a white cloth, look to the sky, and pick 3. And based on what they say, they will make their decisions. And if the runes say, or he doesn't say runes, I have to stop saying that. If the if the advice is to not deliberate any further, then no further decisions will be made that day. And so there is a divination practice that is described here. We don't know what the symbols are. Tacitus, of course, wouldn't know. And we also know that Tacitus was writing around the time when the Elder Futhark was in use. So you could extrapolate and say, oh, well, maybe these symbols that were carved on this fruit bearing, these discs from a fruit bearing branch were the Elder Futhark. We don't know. We just don't know for sure if that's what it was. But that is the way that we have sort of reconstructed Nordic divination utilizing runes. Right? It's like, oh, well, we know that this is a passage in Germania that was, you know, written contemporary to a time when the Elder Futhark was still in use. We don't know what the symbols were. We do know what the Elder Futhark is. Ergo, you know, eh.
Right.
Yeah, so we don't know for sure. We do also know, though, that casting lots and divination because runes had such a firm connection with magic, given the mythology, it's also just not a very difficult leap to make. That you could also use runes for divination.
Definitely. So this modern conception of, because everything's got an origin for the most part, particularly things that are neo-pagan, they're not as mysterious as they once were. Where did modern rune divination come from, truly? If we squint and look back into the past, like where's this using these symbol letters for divining the future? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so this is a very tangled history. And essentially it comes from modern occultists utilizing runes and trying to revive old Nordic ways. Probably around the mid 1800s is when this started to be used for magical or for divination purposes specifically. And that is an area actually that I would like to do more research in explicitly, because there's a lot of other like socio-political stuff that is absolutely fascinating that was happening in Scandinavia and Germany in the mid 1800s. So you can imagine. However, uh there weren't necessarily books published directly on, I think the earliest book about runes for divination. No, we've got pamphlets from like 1890 or so talking about it. I know that there were some books written in the 1930s. There's definitely a book that was written in the 1940s. That kind of goes over Icelandic staves and runes as well. But it's kind of interesting because like the magic and the divination get all like clumped together constantly. So
Definitely.
it's hard to say
Yeah.
like when specifically divination started.
Okay. As a rune diviner yourself, take the folks through what actually occurs. Because I know a lot of people have had rune readings, but for tarot cards, you sit a table, tarot cards put down on the table, usually some kind of pattern, some kind of quote unquote spread. What happens with runes?
Yeah, so there are a couple different ways that you can do it. Sometimes, I'll do like more of a freeform reading where I basically do just like cast the runes on a cloth. And I divine them based on their groupings and the way that they land on the cloth, or I might have different parts of the cloth set aside to relate to different aspects of the person's question. Um, there's a very common reading that is kind of sort of the rune equivalent to a past, present, future reading, but it is a Norn reading. So the three Norns are um, essentially these figures that determine fate in Old Norse mythology. And we have Urd, or that which is, representing the past. We have Verdandi, or that which is becoming, representing the present. It's the moment of becoming. And then we have Skuld, which is that which should be, um, given what happened in the past and what is currently at play now. So that just puts a slightly different spin. I think it's an important reorientation to a past, present, future reading that like places you a little bit more firmly in the culture. I have also done rune readings with people, by having a conversation, and maybe they have a lot of questions, and so they'll ask a question and I will pull a rune, and that might create a chain effect of, like, oh, well, if this, then that, or if like basically generating more further questions based on the answers that you get.
Awesome. Nice. Yeah. For somebody like yourself who does tarot readings and runes, are they fairly similar as far as how the process occurs, or vastly different?
They're pretty different for me. So I I have had other diviners tell me that I have a very clear channel, which I do pride myself in. But so I can be a bit of a predictive reader. I know that not everybody who does tarot or, divination at all considers themselves a predictive reader. I have been. Um, for me, tarot is like, because it was invented so much later, the just like the physical cards, not necessarily like how do we divine with these things, but like the physical cards came into being in the Renaissance, which is, a time when a lot of the ways that we live our lives now under capitalism were like becoming and being formed. So if somebody comes to me and they have a very specific question about their business, or they have very specific questions about kind of modern life, and they want a rune reading, I'll probably gently guide them into a tarot reading instead, just because I find that the tarot cards are a little bit more interested in answering those questions. For me, essentially what rune reading is one way of accessing the web of weird, which is, fate interconnecting all of us. It is the summation of our orlog, or the um, past precedents that has come through the things that we've inherited from our family, kind of generational traumas, generational positives, all of those things. And so then we get to the web of weird, and it's how do all of these things connect in the present? And runes help me see that and unravel that and explain it. Um, Much the way that Seethe, which is another form of Nordic magic, would operate similarly. Um, and so I'm coming from a very different place. I did a rune reading for someone once who is more in the like ancient Greek magical papyri sort of side of the magical spectrum, the beautiful magical rainbow, as it were. And she was like, oh, so this is like communicating with the Oracle of Delphi. And I was like, actually, kind of, yeah, because the runes will give me information that you need, not necessarily an answer to your question. That could be my style as a reader, but if you come to me asking about your career and your love life is a hot ass mess, the runes are going to be like, girl, break up with him. Like, or whatever the message is that you need to hear. It's a little bit less directed. Unless I'm doing that like one rune per question sort of divining, then that's kind of a way of harnessing that and like bringing it down a little bit. But it feels, I do other forms of divination too. Like I practice. Oh my God, I'm getting so nerdy on your podcast.
It's
I
all good.
Yeah. I also practice Orsgong, which is the yearly walk in Nordic folk magic, which is basically like, once a year, you usually on the same day, year after year, year over year. So for a lot of people, that happens to be Christmas Eve or New Year's Day or something like that. You take a ritualistic walk, and from the moment that you leave your house to the moment that you return, you are not allowed to speak, and everything, anything, and anyone that you encounter is an omen to be read. So, we've got practices of augury in here. We've got practices of, I don't know, just reading the omens. So, rune reading feels much more akin to and in relationship with that style of divination. Scrying, all I can say is that it feels very similar in my body when I am doing a rune reading as when I am scrying or practicing augury or doing these other omen based things. Whereas tarot and oracle decks are incredible, but it feels like a very different divination modality.
Definitely. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about an individual here. His name is Johannes Boreas. So, who is this man, and what is his deal with runes and alchemy and Kabbalah? Why are we talking about this guy during a rune episode?
Oh, well, he's just a fantastic little Renaissance weirdo, isn't he? Um, so basically, Johannes Burius is he was a Swedish member. He was a member of the Swedish court in the 1600s, and he was deeply inspired by John Dee and other kind of court alchemists, court magicians at the time. And so he was interested in interacting with these broader, um, esoteric concepts. But he was also interested in kind of like putting a little Swedish spin on it, um, which meant kind of dusting off some runes. And it's really funny because he doesn't actually use, the sets of futharks that we understand as being accurate and good for translation today. He created his own system based on the younger Futhark of the old. It's the Otto Runa or Odo Runa. Trying to remember where the accent is. But basically, he fleshed it out and kind of assigned meanings based on Norse mythology, but he also pulled from Kabbalah and Hermeticism. And he was also really interested in basically getting Swedes to use runes instead of the Roman alphabet. So he actually even like had some strings he could pull, and somehow was able to get an agreement that no alphabet books would be printed without including the Otto runes. This was, of course, very short-lived. Um, his first runic alphabet book was his first Runa ABC was printed in 1611, and the last Runa ABC was printed in 1624. So it's a very short period of time that we've got this, but he's an interesting character. One thing that I think is really interesting with, figures like Johannes Burios and, other kind of Renaissance figures or high magicians, especially in the Scandinavian areas, is that I think there's this assumption that I've been running into this a lot lately, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And it's like there's this assumption that the Scandinavians were really far removed from the rest of Europe, that all of this is, some kind of distinct Scandi only kind of pure ideology, which is absolutely not the case, right? And that absolutely has its roots in the white supremacist appropriation of runes and Nazi occultism. Um, but it kind of echoes further as people thinking, who may not be white supremacists, or, it's just like this cultural zeitgeist thing where people think that the Nords were so separated. But actually, like most of the priests in, while we're still talking Catholic years prior to the conversion to Lutheranism, which was rampant and fast in Scandinavia. Well, we're still talking the Catholic years. A lot of the priests were all trained in Wittenberg, Germany, which was a nexus of occult knowledge. And in fact, there's this like whole literature of folklore in Scandinavia of the Black priests returning from Wittenberg with their books full of spirits. And there are all of these stories about people who are, maybe the priest's apprentice who just, maybe he just wants to like have a clean cottage or something. So he steals the priest's book, and then he accidentally trips and he falls and the book opens, and then all of these devils pop out of the book. So for all these little like folk tales about the Black priests of Wittenberg. So I really see Johannes Burios as being, as much as, a lot of Hermeticists were, somebody with a great deal of power in a high position in society who also had access to occult knowledge from elsewhere in Europe. So there are distinct traditions, but they are always constantly informed by Hermeticism and occultism in the rest of Europe.
Definitely. Yeah, he's an extremely fascinating character, and one that I was kind of surprised I knew nothing about until I started doing research for that. I had no idea who this guy was until a couple of weeks ago. I was like, holy smokes, he's a fascinating character.
Props to you. I actually didn't know very much about him at all until you had you included it in one of the questions for preparation for the episode. But yeah, so you can find a lot of grimoires and old Swedish and Norwegian grimoires and Danish grimoires archived online. And if you can read the languages, and then kind of if you can read the old school style, there's so much materia there. But I'm kind of getting off topic. I think part of it, the reason why you and I hadn't really like heard of him is a lack of translation.
Yeah, it's hard to find. I don't think any of his, I might be wrong, but nothing of Johannes Burius is that he's written is translated in English, I don't believe.
I think that the Runa ABCs, like we do still have those manuscripts. And they would be fairly easy to translate, probably out of, thinking about the entire history of like the Swedish Black books and the, other grimoires that we have from the region. Probably like his works might be some of the easier ones to translate, just because how long can an ABC manuscript really be?
Right.
Although you do have to have the cipher of his own like weird little alphabet. Um, but thankfully the cipher is included in the manuscript. So
there you go. Everybody get on it. That's a new project. Let's get some of Johannes Burius's work out there. I mean, he deserves it, right? John D, everybody's paying attention to that guy. Let's get some Johannes Burius up to bat.
Yeah, right. I think that there's also another one. Sophus Buga is another really interesting one to look into, of just like Scandinavian esotericists, alchemists, etc. Which he actually, I think, had a more, and I say this only because I've studied Nordic folk magic with somebody based in Sweden. And he brought up Sophus Bugge, but not Johannes Burius in class, or I didn't remember the name, so he didn't cover him as thoroughly. So Sophus Bugge also could be a good further research topic.
Definitely. Let's talk about something that occurred, and it's still seemingly occurring to this day. More on that in a second, but let's talk about Romanticism and the Viking revival. What was it, and what part did the Viking revival play in the story of runes?
Yes. So thank you so much for asking this question. I talk about this a lot, like all the time. It's very important, I think. So the Romanticism and Viking revival, and I'm talking specifically about Romanticism, National Romanticism in the 1800s. Um, Across Europe, there was this trend toward the pastoral as and like folk culture as a harkening back to simpler times, but it was also a way that these different nation states were trying to codify their identities. And this is also very much about it's about history, it's about academic history, it's about history of people, it's about all of the lead up into World War I. But essentially, we have this romantic nationalism, which led to a passing interest in the pagan cultures, but they were being utilized for political purposes, right? It's like we are returning to this, pure nation state of Germany or of Sweden or Denmark or France or wherever you are. And that essentially leads to, and it's being, okay, so it's also being fed by several other forces that are happening at the same time. So at the same time, we have the development of anthropology as an academic discipline, which anthropology in its inception was a way of categorizing peoples in a new racial classification system. So anthropology was a way of basically racializing other people, and something that many of us may not, know if we haven't studied like the history of racism and white supremacy. But in this era, even like there was a wrong kind of white to be, right? So like, Irish and Italians were kind of at the bottom of the barrel in terms of European nationalism. And Germans and Aryans ended up, you guessed it, at the top, Aryans, Scandinavians, all of that. And then this was also bolstered by a pride in culture. Um, Culture being the mythology and the Viking revival, the medievalist revival. This was also, funnily enough, a time when medieval studies was really taking off in literature and academia. I mean, at this time we have the British really codifying King Arthur as this sort of hero of the people. This is how like the Brits are how government is supposed to be, and all of these stiff upper lip ideas about supremacy, um and so it's this perfect storm, really, of these ideas that were using folk symbols in order to attempt to prove a sort of supremacy. And, so some of these symbols, of course, we have Wagner's ring cycle, Das Nibelungen, um, came out around this time. And Wagner also had, strong white supremacist and eugenicist leanings. We have other people like Guido von List, who we will be talking about, who essentially, aided and assisted the Volkisch movement in Germany. So it was it was about a unification of Germany, but also about kind of weaponizing those folk beliefs of the people. And of course, might I add, we have this pastiche of folklore and all of these things, but it's not necessarily an interest in um, lifting up, let's say, the lower classes, right? Because the concern here is supremacy. The concern here is power. Um, and so, unfortunately, the runes, as potent symbols of um, Germanic languages, get swept into this as well. So the Elder Futhark was officially decoded. So we didn't necessarily know what letters of the Elder Futhark worked with which sounds until it was translated. It was finally decoded in about, I think the year is like 1863 when it was actually published that it was decoded. So again, like this is happening like right in the middle of all of this. So of course there's this runic fervor. I also think it's, really interesting, and I make several comments about this in the book, that I think it's really interesting that we are consistently looking at the Viking period of Nordic history and not, say the Renaissance period or the Iron Age. People are so interested in this like image of the Viking as this really strong warrior who's going out and conquering, and it kind of writes itself. It is, in a lot of ways, very easy to twist this romanticized image of the Viking into a we are the supreme beings, we are the supreme race. So, very unfortunately, runes get twisted up into this as well. And then throughout, we can talk more about the specific figures in the Volkish movement and how they interacted with runes. But yeah, so they get really heavily involved in all of this geopolitical white supremacist bullshit.
So let's talk about Guido von List. Would you say that it would be an oversimplification to say that Guido von List is perhaps the most important person in the story of why runes are as popular as they are today?
Hmm. If we're talking singular person, singular people, I do think that Guido von List is really up there. For all the worst reasons, you know.
Let's get into it. Look, who is this guy? What did he do?
Yeah, so Guido von List was a member of the Volkisch movement. So for those people who are not familiar with the term Volkisch, it is, German for folkish, which as a Nordic folk witch, by the way, makes things tricky as I'm trying to, talk about my own work as being distinct from white supremacy. But this Volkish movement was really, kind of like, oh, like we're going back to the roots. All the stuff that I was just describing about the kind of agrarian, like, or romantic nationalism stuff. So he started out, he actually was writing for newspapers. He was reporting from the Austrian countryside for Volkish newspapers. And that's how he really started to make his bread and butter and uh get more famous. Then uh he started to turn more to the occult and esotericism. Um he was deeply influenced by the Theosophical Society, which of course had him, thinking again about runology. And he created his own Futhark called the Armanen Futhark, um, which is uh that is another thing where if you are looking at rune books and they're talking about the Armana and Futhark without critique, then that is maybe not a very great source to be getting your rune knowledge from. um, because it is, again, pretty fully fabricated based on this like mythos of, what we believe the runes are, and all mixed up in the white supremacy. But Guido von List essentially had this like grand vision for esotericism. He was temporarily blinded when he needed to get a cataract surgery, and felt that he was getting all of these visions at this time. So he ended up um, doing a lot of writing that promoted the theory that modern society was degenerate, that apocalypse would cleanse society from all of the degenerates, and that they would start over with a new pan-German empire. So again, World War I and World War II are on the horizon. He's writing this in the very early 1900s. He actually passed away or died in 1919. Um, so right at that, in that time period. But he created the List Society, which was uh the religious organization for his particular brand of Wotanism. And Wotanism was something he'd been, talking about for a really long time, but he really codified it with the List Society. Um, and within the List Society, there was a secret inner circle, um, which was called the High Armanen Order, in which, some more of um, these white supremacist ideas really started to circulate. And so, of course, he had a direct influence on the Nazi Party through several prominent, people who were involved with his work. Yeah, so he actually, a lot of his ideas and understandings of the ancient past was not based on empirical research, but it was based on ideas that he claimed to have received as a part of clairvoyant illumination. So again, we're getting those channels. Yeah, so he fully made up the claim that after the Christianization of Northern Europe, the Armanist teachings were passed down in secret. And doesn't that sound familiar to all of us neo-pagans, right? His wisdom passed down in secret. He basically he had several, very famous members of the List Society that ended up going on to found the Reichsschaumerbund and the Germanenorden and the Thule Society, which was really essential in Nazi occultism. The Thule Society was kind of where a lot of those people got their training, I guess.
Yeah, the
So,
Thule
yeah.
Gesellschaft, I believe, is I'm maybe totally butchering the pronunciation there, but yeah, their shadow looms quite large over a lot of stuff that you'll read. But Guido himself, as far as what he was doing with runes, is yeah, it's debatable as to whether or not he's one of the major reasons why runes are as popular as they are today.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of factors there, right? So, a lot of very unfortunately, a lot of the prominent rune authors talk about and pull from Guido von List's, Edward Thorson, pulls from von List's work. And so I'm talking about, once we get into the 60s, 70s, 80s, which is where kind of the explosion of neo-pagan books about runes really takes place, after World War II, in English, like English speaking books about runes, I should say, um, really explodes. And so Guido von List had a pretty big influence on these works. And it's been through some really tireless efforts by a lot of heathen scholars to um, dissociate runes with this kind of poisoned well of von List's teachings. There are a lot of people who are publishing work about runes and about Germanic paganism and Nordic paganism that have really dug deep and, done a lot of like really good work. And I hope that I live up to their legacy. I hope that I'm, part of that canon. It's very much my, a big part of what I did with Queering the Runes was like, okay, fuck this. Um, let's talk about runes in a way that is actually healthy and that is inclusive. So yeah, there's so much there. There's just so much there.
Yeah, it's something that I think that if runes are interesting to people, that you kind of have to know about this history. And I know a lot of people, they don't want to be associated with anything involving that, but it's the history is hard. You got to know about the bad bits. You got to know about where ideas come from, how ideas form. It's as important an element to the story of runes and Guido von List. As I said, his stuff is big.
It's huge. It was hugely influential. Yeah, like it really was. So I don't go into Von List as much as I talk about more like the general geopolitical history, but in the book I do have a chapter on that's just called A Radical Heathen's History of Runes. And so I do have a chapter in there that, kind of pulls on a lot of this research about where this white supremacist thrust comes from. And honestly, part of me wants to write an entire book that's just about like the history of this thing, because I think that these ideas are really important. And it's important to have that in one place that is not academic, because you can find a lot of information about this history like in the ivory tower, but I really wanted to include something in my book that is mass published, traditionally published, like has a broad distribution um for this reason. Um because it's so the concept of Orlog is so important in Norse heathenry, that being that we are made up of all of the actions that our predecessors have taken. Um, and I feel like it is a fate. It is worse than mere spiritual bypassing within this worldview to overlook this. Because if we believe that Orlog is so central to our, religion, to our spirituality, to our ability to heal, we absolutely cannot overlook this history. Like we have to, recognize it, wrestle with it. Um, and, even just on a practical level, like a lot of white supremacist groups operate under the banner of runes. Like they'll have, a rune as a part of their flag. So knowing that, being able to spot it is really important. Knowing how to differentiate yourself if you are a heathen is really important. And the work continues. So another part of how runes spread, and this is post von List, we're talking post World War II now, that I talk about in the book, is that it was illegal in Germany after World War II for Nazi sympathizers to gather. But you could gather under the guise of religion, because there was freedom of basically like freedom of religious gathering. So the way that a lot of people got into prisons and networked after World War II was under the guise of, oh, well, we're heathens, we're pagans. Um, and then this ended up being exported by actually a married couple immigrated. I can't remember their names at the moment, but they immigrated to America and began the project here. So a lot of these white supremacist gangs, organizations, etc., are still fed to this day by that sort of like captive audience prison to white supremacist pipeline. But there are also a lot of heathens that do work explicitly against this. So in my community, there's an elder here in my community who for decades has been going into prisons and being the essentially heathen deacon in these prisons because she is not a white supremacist and she wants to be the actual, pagan faith that is represented in these places. The Toth, not the Toth Society. Oh my God, what am I talking about? That can be like a blooper, like me just being like, not the Toth. But the Troth is an international organization that they also have a lot of prison in-reach programs and do a lot of good. There's a pretty vocal, I would say at this point, a vocal majority of heathens who are like, that is not us. This is not actually essential to our religion.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I have always been one of those people, and I've just reiterating what I just said. But yeah, learning the history of this kind of stuff is fun. The story of the runes is one that's incredibly fascinating. But this other aspect to it is a very important aspect. I have to ask you, Siri, why do you think runes are to this day so fascinating to so many people? People love runes. I was getting emails every month like, when are you going to cover runes? When you've covered I Ching, you've covered tarot cards, you've covered geomancy. When are you going to talk about runes? But why do you think people love runes?
Wow, I'm glad you waited until this long into our interview to tell me that you were receiving monthly emails because no pressure, right?
People love it, but it's also one of those things because I do think, particularly in North America and particularly in new age shops, and I'm not saying this to throw shade in any way, there's so many books, there's just so much material, and it seems like if you look at, and I'm again not throwing shade at any publishing companies because also you just released a book, but if you look at book release schedules, there'll be 20 books being released in say spring, and 5 of them are going to be about runes. Like people love runes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think, it kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning of the episode where runes can be used on so many different levels. We have the linguistic level, we have the divination level, we have the magical level. So there are a lot of different ways that you can interrogate runes. There's also a fascination with the Viking Age, which I think is so funny. Again, like I said, like there's so much other history. The Viking Age was what, like 300 years at most. And it was brutal. And it also is what we have a lot of the literature that we have of, what we kind of considered the canon of Norse mythology, sort of stems from or is a result of the Viking Age. And I'm not just talking about the Eddas, the poetic and prose Edda, I'm also talking about the sagas. So much literature was produced at this time. But part of it is cultural. I think that there is an interesting tendency amongst fantasy authors, and for this I blame Tolkien, to set their worlds in medieval times. And I also have Tolkien to blame for this as well. Tolkien was also fascinated by runes. Um, he was a scholar of Norse mythology and language and all of this stuff. And he wrote The Lord of the Rings in large part to create a similar mythos for England to the kind of mythos that we have from the prose and poetic Eddas. Um, you know, the first time I ever saw runes was in a copy of The Hobbit. Because he just like straight up used the Elder Futhark.
Yeah, they're right there. It's like it's plain as day. It's cool.
Yeah.
If you know what to see, it's like, oh yeah, that's he just took it. It's right there.
Yeah, he just used it. And of course he did, because that was his area of study, like I still to this day, like I was recently reading about Nordic dragons because why wouldn't I be reading about Nordic dragons? And there was like a slap fight in the citations between Tolkien and other scholars about who the best Norse dragon is. So, and I think that really, like in a lot of ways, the interest between pagans and the Venn diagram of people who are fantasy nerds and pagans is very close to a circle. Um, just like one big circle, So I think that that is a huge part of it, culturally, because of the chokehold that, these stories have in fantasy, fantastical literature. I think that people are just going to be fascinated by it. I also am thinking of, things like the Vikings show that came out, and the Game of Thrones even, has a lot of interesting cultural things that are borrowed from the Viking era. So yeah, it's just this fascination. And then of course you have the occult interest. Of course, from all of that comes people who are intrigued by, who want to learn more about, who, have ideas about runes. And runes are themselves such a mysterious little thing that we can do. I mean, we've been talking for, over 2 hours at this point about runes and their occult you know, their occult uses. And I haven't even gotten into Icelandic staves. Like, that's just a whole area that at the beginning of this episode, I was like, we don't have time for that. Like, there's just so much here. So I think that they do have a really interesting staying power. Um, I do think that it's it's funny that you say that so many of the esoteric books that you're seeing when you're walking into new age stores are runes, and I wonder if that's partially your geography. Because for me it's like tarot is there are so many books on tarot, or there are so many books on um uh just ceremonial magic or other kinds of magic, witchcraft. um And it's funny because my first book is actually a book that I co-authored with Cassandra Snow, about tarot, and utilizing tarot for creativity. And people, have asked me, "Oh, are you going to write another tarot book?" And I'm like, "Why?" Like, there's so many people who are writing incredible, amazing, beautiful books about tarot that I feel like the field is so, like, I don't know what I can say about it that other than just like to lift up these other, contemporary authors or authors who are contemporary with me on tarot. Whereas runes, I feel like I do have a very different perspective from what's been published so far.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it could be geography. I'm in Canada. It's snowy up here, right? And so I think maybe there's just something. And while that might sound, kind of glib, I do think that a lot of the people that frequent the new age stores, for the most people, they're going to be whiter people. I've just found that most of the smaller new age shops that I frequent here, a lot of them just have lots of rune stuff, runes, lots of, and that's just how it goes. And so perhaps because of that, I kind of put runes in the I'm not interested in them category, which is I find
Mm.
now having had to do research on runes, I've missed out. Runes actually, to me, might be one of those things where I might have to devote some time into looking just maybe less so the divination aspect of them, but I think they're fascinating. They're artifacts from the past. They're all those Indiana Jones things that I like about Egyptian magic and the Greek magical papyri, but it's just in a different way. I feel kind of bad that I've reached doing magic for well over 20 years, and because of the new age thing, and this is totally on me, I didn't think it was that fascinating. And while doing the research, it's just like, wow, this stuff is real. It's got a lot of scholarly heft behind it, a lot of the introspections about what they were utilized for, and the symbols and the signal, just everything together is very fascinating. And I'm kind of kicking myself. It's like this is the stuff that I love, and I just ignored it because of its overrepresentation. And just a lot of times I pick these books up and I found a lot of them very boring. Like it's just like, okay, like I sure, I don't know, but I feel kind of
A
bad.
lot of them, to be fair to you, a lot of them are very boring.
Shots fired.
I shots fired around the world. But yeah, no, I think that it they really shine when you bring in, the academic theories and the history and all of this. I also shocking no one. I do a lot of sigil witchcraft. And I actually am also like when I'm not doing rune magic and explicitly Nordic magic, I am very much a chaos magician in terms of methodology and the technology that I use. And runes feel, even though they're very historical, they feel so much in line with that. Because they are the symbol, like, making a bind rune is essentially making a sigil, except you're limiting your the symbols that you would use to construct the sigil to just the alphabet, whatever runic alphabet that you're utilizing, and maybe some, flourishes for aesthetic effect. Um, I think that they also do really funny things. Like I've had runes when I'm doing a rune for somebody and I like cast the runes on a cloth, I've literally had them spell out names of like, deceased people in this person's life who had a message for them. And it was powerful, the fact that they are a language that they can be used for these encoded messages is really hugely powerful. They also direct energy in such a unique and interesting way. I had recently, over the course of the last month, actually, I've had three separate people ask me about runes and tattoos and the applications of a runic tattoo. And I realized, oh, when you tattoo a rune on yourself, it's very similar to a glamour because it essentially is like you are projecting that meaning as like a part of your as a part of your being to people, and they will pick up on it, but they won't necessarily like um know, that, oh, this rune that you have tattooed on your body is the helm of awe, therefore, I am intimidated by you. They won't know that, they won't make that connection, although, the Eigishomor, it's not a rune, but it is a symbol that is probably one of the more common Nordic like inspired tattoos, magical tattoos now. um and there's just so many different applications. They're so easy to carve too, like you can very easily, like I've done spells before where I carve them into clay and then I like let them wash away in the river. Or, you can um ice ice them onto cookies and then ingest them as like a, I'm infusing my entire body with this thing. You can chant them. There's an entire area of magic just centered around chanting the runes Galdr. Um, and yeah, they're so holistic in terms of how you can utilize them and operate with them on a magical plane. Um, and then you add the fascinating, weird, twisty, turny history of them, and it's just they're so cool.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that, well, as you mentioned, that the fact that they can be so easily carved is one of the reasons that they proliferated as much as they did, right? Sticks, stones, like you could put them very easily on things. And there's this other element that I'm still trying to do a bit more research on it, as you mentioned a bit earlier, but just the underworld or the world of the dead within a lot of the cultures which utilized what we know as the runes is something that I find incredibly fascinating. I can't speak too much about it right now, but it's just like, oh, okay, there's as you know, I just finished doing a ghost episode, and it's like, oh, I didn't do the history of ghosts, but I started to look into it, and when I realized that it would have to be its own episode, a lot of the Germanic and Scandinavian cultures and their relationship with runes, as well as their ideas of the dead and stuff, it all blends, and it's incredibly fascinating. I can't speak too much about it because I don't think I know enough about it. But as I said, that's what's interesting to me is that in doing research for this show, it's like this is very fascinating. I'm kicking myself that I thought it was not as cool as it was going to be, and that's on me. And I feel kind of stupid because it's 20 or so years of me just being like that seems dumb, and then now I'm like, oh, this is exactly why I want to do magic and why I find this stuff interesting, and I just ignored it. Whoops. Let's say that somebody is unlike me, and then that they're actually quite interested in runes, and they're like, you know what? I want to involve runes in some way in my magic. What to your mind would be the best way, and perhaps the most, maybe authentic's the wrong word, but the most honorable way of involving runes in their magic? And this is the last question I got for you. How would you tell somebody to go from 0 to 60 in involving runes in their life? What's the best course?
Yeah. So first of all, you just have to get to know them, right? So, I think of the runes themselves are a good flashcard, like you can when I was first trying to memorize them, I would just sit there and I would like pull a rune out of my bag and I would try to remember it and I would just like say out loud like the name of the rune and what they do and I, just was trying pure rote memorization. My biggest recommendation as you're getting started, if you're going to get a rune set, is to not get a deck. So there are many different decks that like will be like, oh, this is a rune deck, or this has the pictures of the runes on them, and but the way that I work with runes as a diviner doesn't work with cards, right? So like you can't really cast runes on a cloth if you have cards. They're just not going to do what they're supposed to do, right? I have nothing against cards. If you want to get them as like a visual aid or as a this is really pretty or as a sort of flashcard situation, like you can definitely go for it, but getting the actual like rune stones or wooden runes or bone runes or something like that is going to be the most important. And then the other things are start reading, I mean, unfortunately, I don't get into the magic aspect of it quite as much in my book. I do have a section that is on rune magic. There are many other people who talk about it. Probably the simplest form of rune magic to begin with is Galder, which would be to chant the runes aloud, to make songs with them, to kind of use them like verbally to like, recite them and that kind of thing. So, and there's no one real way of doing that. Like, you don't necessarily have to follow specific tones, although you can experiment with that. And then after that, I would recommend, starting to think about bind runes. So, like combining runes in order to create a sigil, essentially, or like a symbolic rune and have fun. Just have fun with them, you know? The other thing too that I think is really beneficial is, they are the way that I like to describe them is that they are a culturally specific type of magic, but they are not a closed practice. Culture can be learned, right? You can immigrate to a place and learn about the culture. You can blend, your culture with the culture of the runes or other family members. There have always been vast migrations of people. It's very silly to say that there is one pure way of doing this, but beginning to incorporate aspects of Nordic culture will help you to get to know them on a very deep level, I think, because like I said, they can be very culturally specific. Just, like, oh, this is the Nordic kind of concept of what a horse is, right? Versus other cultures might have slightly different relationships with horses. And a really good way of doing that is to read the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, is to just read the Nordic literature. Read a couple of choice sagas. Not all of them. They're called sagas for a reason. They're very long. Um, but there are some that actually do. There are some sagas remaining to this day that do very seriously describe Nordic magic workers. Specifically like Eric the Red saga or Burnt Njal saga are a couple that you could read. So those would be my recommendations. And of course, there's no shortage of resources out there to help you learn them. You know, uh, not to completely plug myself, but I did just release a book. It's called Queering the Runes.
Let's
And
talk about it.
I
Let's talk about it. So, what will
all right.
folks get? What will folks get if they pick up Queering the Runes?
Yeah, so I am a queer person. I am non-binary and in a queer relationship. And um, basically, this is a very modern look at the runes, kind of filtering them through a queer lens. But I do also have chapters just on, like the history of runes, as we've talked about extensively on this podcast. I do have chapters on, basic divination with runes, and I wrote it so that it would be a good entry point for people who were unsure of what was a safe entry point for working with runes. Um, and it pairs really nicely with the Heathen's Journey podcast, as well. So, you can read the book, listen to the podcast, kind of like they work together nicely. But it is very in the book I have a chapter for each rune and or a short section for each rune and journal prompts to help you kind of learn them on your own as well, like to build your own relationships, because I do feel as though it is a very relational um thing.
What made you want to write this book? Again, I mean, there are a lot of books about runes. What made you want to be like, I want to throw my hat into the ring?
When I was first starting out, I knew the history of white supremacy and runes, and I was very afraid. I didn't know what sources were safe. I didn't know what sources, even if they weren't overtly white supremacist, I didn't know what sources would be overly heteropatriarchal. Um, I made a rule for myself that I would, that I would prioritize reading books by women authors in this space. And then I found out that a couple of them were TERFs. So that was like, okay, cool. Love that for me. And so I also just, I learn very much through writing, um, organizing my brain, putting things into words, doing the research. I consider the research also as like a part of the writing process. So very shortly after I decided to uh, dive into runes, I was just trying to get started as a freelance writer, and so I pitched an article series. I ended up pitching it to this blog called Little Red Tarot, which was a feminist and queer tarot blog. Beth Maiden, who was the primary author and the person behind the blog, was based in the UK, but I basically pitched it as like, hey, this is a divination practice, and I'm going to write about what I'm learning as I'm going. And it's going to be called The Heathen's Journey, because you've got the Fool's Journey, don't you? So now we've got the Heathen's Journey. And so it has always been, my learning the runes has always been a writing project, like from the beginning. And it only made sense after a while as my thoughts were getting more and more uh what's the word? As my thoughts were coalescing, it made more and more sense to kind of form it into a book.
Whereabouts can people grab that? Just take it from any of the major bookstores? Is it
Yeah. Yeah. I So for folks who are in the United States, I actually have a bookstore. It's
right?
called Lore Books and Supplies. So you can order it directly from me and I will sign it and send it to you. But it is, hi Kat, it is published through Wiser Books. So anywhere that you can get occult books, you can either purchase it or request that they get it. I also love to remind people that you can request your libraries to get these books as well. And then, they'll be like, oh, somebody has requested this occult book, I guess, and they'll, get the occult book for their shelves. So if funding is a problem, that is always a good way to go. And there is an ebook and audiobook version as well.
Oh, very cool. All right. Amazing. Covering all the bases there. Good stuff. You also have a podcast, and I just found out recently that you have the Heathen's Journey, which I mentioned at the beginning of the show. But there's something else. There might be another podcast because your life isn't busy enough. So let's make it even more confident. So tell folks about Heathen's Journey and tell them about this new project.
Yeah, so the Heathen's Journey podcast is my I took a massive hiatus from it while I was writing the book because it didn't make sense to write episodes for the podcast while I was doing the book, but I do have a lot of really amazing interviews on there. Always so inspired by the guests that I bring on. And it covers all versions of all aspects of heathenry. So not just rune stuff, but of course, runes are a huge part of it. And the new podcast that I'm coming out with is going to be called Chaos and Cunning. The first episode will release on December 20th. And it is the idea behind Chaos and Cunning is looking at the intersections of folk magic and chaos magic. So folk magic being the culture. Um, oh my God. Sorry, my cat is like very needy right now. Um, so Chaos and Cunning is looking at the culture, the folk through which we practice magic, the lens through which we, view the world, is our culture. But it's also looking at chaos magic as in how can we be the most effective magicians that we possibly can be? Because I feel like chaos magic is so much a philosophy of how to be effective at performing magic. And basically, I'm coming out with this podcast because I love heathenry, but it is only a part of my practice. And so I want to, talk about these other aspects of my practice as well in a space that isn't so heathen branded.
Okay, nice. And people can find that. It's on Spotify. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's available everywhere.
Yeah, it'll be available wherever podcasts are. I almost said wherever podcasts are sold, wherever you get your podcasts.
Your podcatcher, whatever. Yes, there will be links in the show notes, of course. Everybody. How about classes? You were mentioning to me that in the past you've done classes and that you've got a class coming up. So talk a bit about what's happening with those.
Yes. So I'm also working hard behind the scenes to get Queering the Runes, the course, released into the world. So this is basically Queering the Runes, but more gay this time. Um, even more queering and even more runes. There are a lot of space constraints with writing a book, and there are a lot of things that I wanted to include in the book that I couldn't. Not, yeah, it's just, you have a limited amount of pages. So I have been developing all of that extra material into a course. It will be a self-guided course. However, Once the material drops and is open, I will have regularly scheduled office hours, and you can, book appointments with me to go over anything that you're struggling with in the course, materials, and get some of that like individualized support. And uh, so the course is going to be structured. There will be introductory lectures about, like a lot of what we've covered in this podcast episode. Like, what are the runes? What is this history? I'll talk about Guido von List. I'll talk about, a lot of that stuff in the course as well. And then I'm going to have a full lecture for each rune. So full lecture, probably between 20 minutes to a half hour on every single rune. And there will be a lot of, prompts for journaling along the way and that kind of thing. So that is going to open for pre-order probably early next week. So we're recording this the week of American Thanksgiving. So it'll probably be opening up for pre-order around December 2nd or 3rd. And then all of the material will drop on January 29th.
There you go. Nice. Wow. Even more queering the runes. It's queering the runes, but more.
Yes, more, so much more.
Wonderful. Where can folks find you on the internet? Are you on Instagram? You have a Patreon, do you not as well? What do you do on the Patreon?
Oh my God. Yes, I do have a Patreon. So my Patreon is patreon.com/Siri Vincent Plouff, just my full name. And on the Patreon, I publish some of the weirder things that I get up to behind the scenes. I do have only two tiers of it at the moment. There's the $5 tier, which is kind of like, oh, we want, personalized, we want the behind the scenes looks as well as first looks at writing, new essays, that kind of thing. Today I actually just released an essay about the Black Friday, Thanksgiving, and the egregores of capitalism and colonialism in America. So heavy shit. It's not always that heavy. Sometimes I just talk about like goofy little chaotic things that I do as a professional witch. And I have a tier on it that is actually the community supported magic tier, which is my favorite. And that is once a month, the first Sunday of every month. I open space for my $15 a month patrons to come together for a community ritual. Most of the time, this is just, me assisting them through, petitions, personal petitions, doing like blessings and sharing healing energy. Um, that sounded so wishy-washy, but
No, I'm interested.
yeah, so it's fun. We actually do magic. We do community supported magic. And sometimes, like this past month in November, for whatever reason, I had to reschedule the first Sunday ritual. And so it ended up being that it was the weekend after the election that I was scheduled to do this. And so we did a collective ritual around a courage stone, like enchanting a stone to help us with courage and, the resistance against fascism. And so we get up to some fun stuff in there.
Nice. Wonderful. And are you on Twitter or X or Blue Sky or are you
Oh
on?
God, yes.
Yeah.
So I am on Instagram. So my personal account is siri.vincent.plouff. And that's kind of my author account. That's where I, share some, it's kind of a mix of personal and author related stuff. But I also, for my shop, which is Lore Books and Supplies, I have a Lore Books Instagram, which is lore.books.mn. And I'm on Threads for both accounts as well, which is the Instagram, Twitter. But I am also on Blue Sky. Which what is my handle even? If you search me on Blue Sky, I'm assuming you will find me.
I'll
Um,
have a link in the show notes, everybody. It'll be there in the show notes.
yeah. Oh, it's at Siri V Plouff at Blue Sky. I keep it. I'm pretty publicly a witch, so if you just look for my name in your favorite places, you can usually find me, except for X. I was part of the Exodus several years back.
No doubt. And the website that you have, your personal website, for people that might want some book recommendations, Siri has quite a few of them up there on her personal website. Where can people find that? Find your personal website.
Yeah, so my personal website is SiriVincentPlouff.com. I do have anti-racist heathen resources on there as well. So, trusted organizations that I know of. If you are listening to this episode and you are a heathen and you have a anti-racist organization, or you do anti-racist work, and are seeking students or whatever, please feel free to reach out to me and I can add you to that list. It's ever growing. And then I also, of course, the bookshop has its own website as well, which is lore-books.com.
All of the things that we have just been talking about over the last 15 minutes, all of the places to find Siri and order their book, and all of the things will be available at my personal website for this podcast. That is whatmagicisthis.com. Head there. Also, there's going to be some pretty cool show notes having to do with these runes and the runic calendar, all of the pretty much almost all of the things we talked about on this show. There's going to be some kind of a show note regarding that. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, please, and check out those show notes. They're pretty good. So do you like what I do here at What Magic Is This, and you would like to support me in some way, shape, or form? The best form is through money. I'm just going to say. I like support of all kinds, but the best kind, the kind that keeps me doing this podcast as my job, as this is my job, is supporting me by showing some kind of financial support. And so there's a few ways of doing that. Let's go through each and every one of them. I'll try not to make it too long, but best way of supporting me is through Patreon. That's patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click on any number of the support me on Patreon buttons there. They're all over the place. It's like a bad rash on my website, or a good rash, a great rash. It is like a fantastic rash on my website. Click the support me on Patreon. I've started this one with talking about rashes. Support me on Patreon. It's only $7 US a month. It's about $9.50, $10 Canadian. That's about £6 UK. Anyways, it goes to keeping this show as awesome as it is. That gives you access to all kinds of things. It's basically a whole other podcast show. I do shows about all sorts of things. Occult books that I like. I do shows about specific entities and saints. I literally just finished an episode that took me nearly 2 months to do. It's an hour-and-a-half episode on Saint Michael, the archangel. I just called him Michael because, Christianity is not the only place that Saint Michael appears. In fact, Saint Michael's name actually just means who is like God in Hebrew. So Michael is an amazing figure, 2,000-year lineage at least, and one of the most popular entities of all time. In fact, let's do that thing where I give you a little sample of the kind and sort of thing that I get up to on the Patreon. So this is my recent episode about the Archangel Michael. The Michael in Enoch is maybe one of my favorite portrayals of Archangel Michael as a character in a great story. He has seemingly some kind of a depth that is not shown in other places and in other literature. One in which he is talking with the angel Raphael, and he laments just how they have treated the fallen angels. And Michael kind of takes a step back and is like, men are pretty bad too sometimes, and I doubt that the fallen angels would have had any kind of influence on men who would already do evil things. So he's got a thought process. Something else which you see in Enoch as far as Archangel Michael is that there are these oaths that were used to bind the fallen angels and to keep them under control of God's will. And one of these oaths is called Ake, Akae. And this oath is given to Michael. And in Enoch, the book of Enoch, it is said that this specific oath is the oath of creation. So Michael, it's so weird. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people bring up, and I don't want to make too big of an issue of it because this happens, this sort of thing happens quite a lot when you go into literature. That's kind of out of the norm, like the book of Enoch is, and also when dealing with angels. But Michael has this oath, which is given a name, but it's not the actual, it's not the actual thing itself, as this just kind of thing occurs within Hebrew. But I'm not doing a great job of explaining it. But here we go. Michael has the power of the words that can be used for creation. Basically, Michael has not the power to, but he has the blueprint for the universe's creation and everything in it, right? Like he can't do that thing that Yahweh can do, that only that God, that one God is capable of creation, and everything in the beginning was the Word, and all of that kind of stuff. But he possesses the know-how, truly, which is such an interesting facet to Michael that it warrants me bringing up here in this episode. The things that Michael does in the Book of Enoch are fairly interesting. They show Michael as a somewhat complete character, whoever wrote the series of books and treatises that we consider the Book of Enoch. Without going too deeply into all of the bits that make Enoch such an interesting text, I will say that they're one of the final appearance, I believe, of Michael in the Book of Enoch, I could be wrong about this, is in a book called the Book of Parables, which ends with this character of Enoch being taught I want people to make a note of this. If Michael is interesting to you, take note of this, that it is Michael that teaches Enoch and shows Enoch, quote, all the secrets of mercy and the secrets of righteousness. So that's just a little snippet of the kind of thing that I go into in this episode. Again, about an hour and a half long. It's lovely. Feedback has been pretty good so far, and it goes in a very interesting direction, I will just say that. Also on the Patreon, there's just so many great things. I can't list them all here, but all I can say is that for $7 American a month, you're basically getting a whole different show. In my opinion, it is my best work. All of the things that I do on the Patreon are so dear to me. I think that they're great. I think they're wonderful. They're such a great dive in and a way to see the kind of magic and the things that really, truly interest me and kind of keep the What Magic Is This tank fueled up and full of creativity. Best place that is showcased is on my Patreon. I'd love to see you there. It also gives you access to a fantastic Discord server. If you join the Patreon for 1 month, you have access to the Discord server for as long as it's going to be up, right? So pays for itself because I'm there every day, truly just chatting with people, offering assistance where I can, and helping people do certain things. To a degree, obviously. I'm busy. I got a lot of work to do as well, so I just don't sit on the Patreon. On the Discord, but it's really great. We have a wonderful community there. Everybody is so great and so lovely and so nice. I love each and every one of them because I know they're listening. Anyhow, patreon.com/whatmagicis is the best. Truly, $7. That's it. That's all I'm asking for. Whore different show. I just said whore different show. Pardon me. I'm just gonna take a sip of water here. It's a whole different show on the Patreon.
Patreon.com/whatmagicisthis or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the links there. If you don't like the Patreon, you just want to throw me $5, $10, $20, $200,000 because I know you got that spare. You got $200,000 just burning a hole in your wallet. I can't talk. Burning a hole in your wallet. Please, I'd love some of that, if not all of that. Just head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the PayPal, and you can donate it through PayPal. And it just goes right back into making this podcast run the way that it does. And just everything's expensive. Keeping this podcast as good as it is, it costs me money. And so if you donate through the PayPal, that just goes right back into making putting some steam in this engine and keeping it chugging along, doing the thing that it does. There's another way of supporting me that also helps support yourself. And by support yourself, I mean your brain, your knowledge, your wisdom, and that is through books. I have a virtual bookshop, just like Siri. I've got a bookshop.org account. So what happens is that if I talk about a book on this show and you're like, I want to get that book, go to my website, which is whatmagicisthis.com, head to the episode page, and then click on the book that is recommended in the show notes, and then it'll take you to my virtual bookshop. Or you just head there yourself. That is bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, and you'll see that each and every one of the book lists there is organized by the episode itself. Find the episode you want, and then click, and you'll see all the books. Pretty much 90% of the books that I mentioned are still being sold for the most part. Sometimes there's a back order or two, but then just click that. What happens is that you are supporting local bookshops across Canada and the United States. And what also happens is that I get a small little cut, almost mafia-esque. I get about $1 or $2 every time that you order a book from my virtual bookshop, and you get your book. And it comes really fast. It's as fast as that other book company, the huge one, the Omnicorp book company. And it just goes to help these independent bookshops, and it goes to help me a little bit. I would love for you to buy a book through my virtual What Magic Is This bookshop. It's also just cool to scroll on it and just check out all of the covers of the books that I mentioned, because I mentioned so many books. And usually each and every episode there's at least 12 to 15 books up on those lists. So grab yourself a book. You help magic, you help independent booksellers, and you help me. That is bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on the books in the show notes, and you will be able to go there. I would love for you to grab some books, because truly the Western magical tradition is book-based. It's us writing this stuff, copying things down, transcribing, putting them in grimoires. That's why you have the magic that you do today, for the most part. All right? And the last way of supporting me is by showing your support by grabbing yourself some sort of merchandise. That's t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, what else? Fridge magnets, stickers, laptop cases, tapestries. Actually, no tapestries. No tapestries on the walls. But I do have like wall hanging things. Coffee mugs, travel mugs. Oh, you name it, I've got it, for the most part, except for the notebooks. Notebooks are not back yet. Sorry, everybody. The notebooks were my favorite. Anyhow, if you want to grab something with What Magic Is This logos, I've got about 13 logos on there. Truly, you're going to love at least one of the logos. Go to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu, head to merchandise, click that. It's done through TeePublic. I see very little money every time you order from my merchandise store, just like 50 cents or so every time you order something. But I do love seeing people wearing my stuff. And if you do order some clothes like a hoodie, or you do get yourself a coffee mug, please send me a picture. I would love to see it. I just absolutely love when people are wearing my stuff. It just tickles me pink. And I love a good tickle. And I like being pink. I love being tickled pink. So if you want some shirts or some hoodies or any of the things that I previously mentioned, best thing to do is head to whatmagicisthis.com, and then, yes, grab yourself some merch. But again, don't see too much, but love seeing it. And yeah, you wear it and you walk around, people will ask. They truly will. And it's really cool because you get to tell them that it's your favorite podcast. And they'll be like, are you a Satanist? And you'll say, better. I'm a practicing magician, motherfucker. And they'll go, show me a trick. And you'll go, sure, watch me disappear from this conversation. And you'll just keep on walking. This has happened, truly. Wow. My girlfriend's laughing in the background. I made her laugh. I hope I am making you laugh. I try to, each time I do these things, I try to at least have some kind of funny stuff in them. Anyhow, everybody, all of the things that I've talked about on this one are available at my website. That is the best website to go to. It's for God, all of the things, literally everything I talked about in this last little while here. Head to whatmagicisthis.com and check them out.
Well, everybody, that's basically the episode. We're going to have all those links on the show notes to this site. I hope you learned something, everybody, because yeah, I was not expecting to be as interested in runes as I got, and as I was making my way through, and I know I keep repeating myself. I was like, man, it's too bad it's taken me this long to actually look into this kind of thing. But I know that this will not be the last time that I will be talking about runes on What Magic Is This. I hope that if you were amenable to come back on the podcast, Siri, that you'd like to do so, and we can chat about more of these weird, wacky, strange things that we call runes.
I would absolutely love to come back and talk more about it. And also, if you're interested in Nordic necromancy shit, let's talk.
Definitely. Always room for a drugger or two, right? Always room.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. That is the show, everybody. I hope you learned something about runes here. And man, there's so much to go on. There'll be some great links in the show notes, so please check them out. But that's all we have time for today. So until next time, everybody, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.